The sun had barely climbed over the mesas when the wind carried the smell of iron and smoke across the plains. The cowboy rode alone, his coat torn, his hat pulled low to guard his eyes from the grit of the desert. His name was Luke Braddock, a drifter known across 3 territories, not for his charm, but for the quiet way he handled trouble. He'd fought in the border wars, worked cattle drives for wages that barely bought whiskey, and hunted down men who thought they could outrun their debts. Yet nothing had prepared him for what waited at the end of this ride. He was on his way to Fort Dalton, a frontier post straddling the uneasy line between white settlers and the Apache Nation. 2 days earlier, a sheriff from Santa Mesa had promised him $1,000 to deliver a stolen army horse back to the fort, a fine gray stallion taken by outlaws during a raid. Luke had tracked the thieves through canyons and dry riverbeds, fought off one who tried to ambush him at dawn, and rode the horse back himself. It had been a brutal chase, and his shoulders still throbbed from where a bullet had grazed him. As he neared the fort, the flag flapped hard against the pale sky. Soldiers lounged by the gates, squinting as Luke approached. Their eyes followed the stallion more than the man. The gray was a prize, a creature too fine for the dust and death of the frontier. Captain Halloran met him outside the gate, a hard-faced man with pale eyes and a neat mustache that seemed too civilized for the desert. He looked Luke up and down, his gaze sharp as a bayonet. Luke dismounted, handed over the reins, and waited for the sound of coins, but none came. Instead, the captain smiled a strange, cold smile and said something that made Luke's stomach tighten. "Your reward is ready," he said, "but not in money." From the barracks came a murmur, a shift in the air. Soldiers gathered, whispering as 2 men led out a woman in torn, faded buckskin. Her hands were bound, her feet bare. She was Apache, her face proud, her eyes filled with a quiet, burning defiance that struck Luke like a blow. Her dark hair fell tangled around her shoulders, and streaks of dirt marked her cheekbones. But even in that state, she carried herself like someone who refused to bow to the world. Halloran gestured toward her, as if presenting a trophy. "She's your payment. Captured last week during a raid near Silver Butte. The men thought you'd prefer something more lasting than cash." Luke stared, unable to speak. The soldiers laughed, a coarse, hollow sound that carried across the yard. He had seen slavery before, though they called it by other names out here. Women taken, sold, or traded like goods between forts and settlements. It had always sickened him, though he'd never been the kind to fight another man's cruelty. But now, standing in that hot, dusty yard, he felt something twist inside him. He wanted to throw the money offer back in their faces, to tell them where they could shove their reward. But he also knew what would happen to her if he walked away. The soldiers would keep her, or worse. The Apache woman met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were steady, fierce, and filled with something that wasn't fear. Not yet. Luke turned to the captain and said nothing. He simply took the rope that bound her wrists and led her toward his horse. The men jeered behind him, shouting things that burned in his ears. But Luke kept walking, one slow step at a time, until the fort was nothing more than a shadow in the distance. By the time the sun began to fall, they had reached the edge of the canyon. The land around them glowed red and gold, as if the earth itself burned from within. Luke stopped by a shallow stream and cut the rope loose. The woman rubbed her wrists but didn't run. She just stared at him, her chest rising and falling, her expression unreadable. Luke threw down his hat, sat by the water, and said nothing. For a long while, the only sound was the wind through the sage and the faint call of a hawk overhead. He didn't know what he was supposed to do with her. Keep her, protect her, set her free. The idea of owning another human being filled him with disgust, but he also knew that letting her go here, with soldiers still patrolling the plains, would be the same as killing her. Night began to fall, painting the rocks in shadow. He built a fire, half expecting her to run when darkness came. But she didn't. Instead, she sat across from him, silent and still, watching the flames dance between them. Something unspoken passed through the space. Something fragile, uncertain, but alive. Luke knew then that the road ahead was about to get much more dangerous. Because the reward he'd been given wasn't a prize at all. It was a burden the world would never forgive him for carrying. And as the moon climbed high above the desert, he realized that the soldiers at the fort would not forget this either. Some debts, he thought, are paid not in gold, but in blood. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of distant hoofbeats. Luke looked up sharply. Trouble was coming, and it was coming fast. The night had turned sharp and cold. The kind of cold that crept under the skin, and made every sound echo louder in the dark. Luke Braddock sat by the dying fire, the glow painting his weathered face in amber light. The Apache woman slept a few yards away, wrapped in a thin blanket he had thrown her way. Her breathing was soft, steady, the only peaceful thing in a world that felt like it was closing in. But the peace wouldn't last. From the distance came the faint thunder of horses. A dozen or more, moving fast. Luke's instincts flared like lightning. He rose without a sound, boot soles sinking into the dust. He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowing against the faint glimmer of movement. Whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. They were tracking. He had heard that sound too many times before. The rhythm of pursuit, the heartbeat of men who had something to prove. He doused the fire with a handful of dirt, plunging them into shadow. The woman stirred, opening her eyes, and saw the sudden change in his posture. Fear flickered across her face, but she didn't scream. She seemed to understand danger without words. Luke motioned toward the horses, grabbed his saddle, and gestured for her to move. Together, they slipped into the canyon's darkness, where towering red walls rose like ancient sentinels against the sky. The ground was rough, scattered with stones and dry brush. Every sound they made seemed to carry. Behind them, the riders drew closer. A band of soldiers, no doubt sent by Captain Halloran to retrieve what he believed was still army property. Luke knew what men like Halloran thought. The Apache woman wasn't a person in their eyes. She was a spoil of war, a symbol of dominance. And Luke, by taking her away, had just made himself an enemy of the very army he'd once served. The canyon twisted ahead, narrowing until it became a path barely wide enough for one horse at a time. The moon slid behind a bank of clouds, cloaking them in near darkness. Luke's breath came slow, steady, his hand resting on his revolver. He knew he couldn't outfight 12 men. But he might outthink them. At a narrow bend, he stopped and studied the rocks above. The cliffs hung loose with shale and sand, and one good strike could send half the ledge collapsing onto the path below. He climbed partway up, found a long fallen branch, and wedged it between two boulders. The Apache woman watched from below, her eyes gleaming faintly in the dark. She didn't speak, but there was a sharpness in her gaze, as if she already understood his plan. Moments later, the soldiers reached the mouth of the canyon. Their lanterns swung like fireflies in the night, throwing long, dancing shadows on the rock walls. Luke could hear their laughter, harsh and careless. They thought they had cornered a simple cowboy with his stolen prize. He waited until they were halfway through the bend. Then he kicked the branch loose. The sound came like thunder, a roar of falling stone, the crash of rock and dust filling the narrow gorge. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the lanterns went spinning into the dark. The path filled with smoke and chaos, and Luke didn't wait to see who survived. He caught the woman's arm and pulled her into a side ravine, where a dry creek bed wound deeper into the desert. They ran for what felt like miles, the sound of pursuit fading behind them. By the time they stopped, the first pale light of dawn was spilling over the canyon rim. Both of them were coated in dust, their breaths ragged. The woman sank to her knees by the dry creek, exhausted. Luke stood over her, scanning the horizon for movement. Nothing but silence. The kind of silence that came after danger had passed, but before safety was certain. For the first time since he'd left the fort, Luke let himself breathe. He looked at her. Really looked. She was young, maybe no more than 20, but her eyes carried a weight far beyond her years. There were faint scars on her wrists, fresh enough to tell a story he didn't need to hear to understand. She turned her face away, refusing to meet his gaze, as if pride was the only shield she had left. Luke respected that. In a land that stripped people of everything, pride was sometimes the last thing a soul could cling to. He gathered dry brush and struck a spark to it, starting another fire. The smell of burning sage filled the morning air. When he held out a tin cup of water, she hesitated, then took it, not as a gift, but as an exchange between two survivors. The sun climbed higher, setting the canyon walls aflame with light. Luke knew they couldn't stay. The soldiers would regroup, and when they did, they'd follow his tracks. The only chance they had was to cross the mesa and disappear into Apache country. Dangerous ground for a white man, but the only place where the army might not follow. He looked at her again, wondering if she'd lead him there or leave him to die. Once they reached it, he didn't blame her either way. They rode on that morning, him in the saddle, her walking beside the horse, the reins in her hand as if she were leading him instead. The desert stretched wide and endless before them, the sun blazing hard overhead. Every mile felt heavier than the last. Luke's mind drifted to what had brought him here. The choices that had turned him from a soldier into an outlaw, from a hired hand into a man running for his life with someone else's chains in his hands. By midday, a hawk circled high above, its cry slicing through the silence. Luke shaded his eyes and saw movement in the far distance. Riders again, maybe 2 or 3, too far to tell if they were scouts or bounty men. The chase wasn't over, it had only begun. He spurred the horse forward, calling her silently to follow. They climbed toward the mesa's rim, the land turning rough and steep. The air grew thin, the wind sharper. And as they reached the top, the world opened before them. A vast stretch of wilderness, untouched by white men's boots, shimmering under the endless blue. It was Apache land, her land. Luke knew crossing it meant risking his life, but staying behind meant certain death. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, her eyes softened, not in kindness, but in recognition. She knew the choice he was making. Behind them, a single gunshot cracked across the canyon, echoing like a warning. Luke didn't look back. He kicked the horse into motion, and together, they vanished into the burning heart of the desert. The desert changed as the sun dipped lower in the sky. What had been a burning wasteland, by day turned into a kingdom of shadows by dusk. The wind swept across the mesa, carrying the scent of sage and dust, whispering through the rocks like voices from another world. Luke Braddock rode in silence, his eyes fixed on the endless horizon. The Apache woman walked beside the horse, tireless despite the miles. Her bare feet left faint impressions in the sand, fleeting traces that the wind quickly erased. It was as if the land itself was protecting her, swallowing her tracks, hiding her from the white men who hunted them. Behind them, the world of soldiers and forts faded into memory. Ahead lay a wilderness few dared to enter. The land was her people's. Vast, sacred, unforgiving. Luke felt its weight with every breath. By nightfall, they reached a valley carved by centuries of wind and rain. Tall rock spires rose like sentinels, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Luke dismounted and let the horse drink from a shallow pool that shimmered under the moonlight. The Apache woman stood near the water's edge, her reflection trembling on its surface. She knelt, touched the water gently, and closed her eyes. The gesture was slow, deliberate, not of thirst, but of reverence. Watching her, Luke realized she wasn't afraid of this land. She belonged to it in a way he never could. For the first time since they'd met, he felt like the outsider. They spent the night in the shelter of a rock alcove. The stars burned bright above them, scattered across the sky like cold fire. Luke couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the sound of gunfire from the canyon, the look in Captain Halloran's eyes, and the weight of the decision he had made. He had taken a woman from the army. Not for lust or greed, but because something in him refused to leave her there. Yet he knew what the world would see. To them, he was no hero. He was a traitor, a thief of government property, a man condemned by both sides. The woman slept lightly, her body tense even in rest. Once, she stirred, whispering something in her native tongue. A name, maybe, or a memory. Luke didn't know the words, but he understood the pain that shaped them. At dawn, they continued their journey. The land grew harsher. The mesas rose higher, and the path twisted through narrow ravines. Luke's horse began to stumble from exhaustion. He walked beside it now, shoulder to shoulder with her, the line between captor and captive blurring more with each step. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast plain dotted with mesquite and wild grass. In the far distance, smoke curled lazily into the air. Thin, gray columns that spoke of life. Luke froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But the woman's reaction was different. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, something like hope flickered across her face. She recognized the smoke. Luke realized then that they were close to an Apache camp, her people's home. He stood at the edge of the ridge, torn between fear and duty. If they found him with her, they would kill him without question. Yet if he turned back now, the soldiers would find them both. The woman began to walk downhill, her steps quick and sure. Luke followed at a distance, his heart pounding like a drum beat. As they neared the plain, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and the faint sound of voices carried by the wind. They reached a cluster of brush huts and hide tents, half hidden among the rocks. Children ran between them, their laughter sharp and light. Dogs barked, and the rhythmic sound of women grinding maize echoed softly through the air. But when they saw her, the woman who had been taken, everything stopped. The camp fell silent. Faces turned. Eyes widened. Warriors stepped out from the shadows, their expressions hard as flint. Luke stood frozen. He knew that to them, he was the enemy. The symbol of everything had taken their land, their people, their freedom. His hand twitched near his holster, but he didn't draw. The woman walked forward, straight, backed and unafraid. She spoke to them in words Luke couldn't understand. Her voice firm, echoing across the camp like a song carried by the wind. He didn't need to know the language to understand its meaning. She was telling them what had happened. Some looked at Luke with hatred. Others with confusion. But one older man, his hair silver with age and his face lined by sun and sorrow, listened in silence. When she finished, he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Luke waited for death. But it didn't come. The elder turned and motioned for him to follow. Luke hesitated, but the woman glanced back at him, and something in her eyes told him to trust. They led him to the center of the camp, where a fire burned low and steady. The old man studied him for a long time, then spoke, not in anger, but in the quiet tone of judgment. Luke didn't know the words, but he understood the meaning. He was being measured, weighed by the code of a people who had seen too much betrayal to give trust easily. Hours passed. The sun began to set again, casting the world in red and gold. Finally, the elder rose, placed his hand on the woman's shoulder, and nodded once more. Whatever she had said, whatever truth she had given them, it had spared Luke's life. That night, they allowed him to stay near the campfire's edge. The woman sat beside her people again, her face softening in the firelight. Luke watched from a distance, his heart heavy and strange. He had brought her home. That should have been the end. But as the flames flickered and the stars returned, he knew it wasn't. Because something bound them now, something deeper than captivity or gratitude. And when dawn came again, the horizon glowed red with more than sunrise. Smoke rose in the east. Dark, thick, and full of promise. The soldiers had found their trail. The night before the dawn attack was eerily quiet. The stars hung low and sharp in the desert sky, and the wind carried a stillness that felt unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. The Apache camp slept under the open heavens, unaware that death was riding toward them from the east. Luke Braddock sat alone at the edge of the camp, staring into the dying embers of the fire. His mind was heavy with thoughts he couldn't name. He had brought her home, the Apache woman who had been given to him like property. But in doing so, he had led the soldiers straight to her people. He knew it. The army always followed its trails, and Luke's tracks were as clear as ink on parchment. He should have kept moving, should have led the pursuit in another direction. But something inside him, guilt, wariness, or maybe the faint hope that she would be safe, had brought him here instead. Now under the silent desert sky, that choice felt like a curse. From the shadows, the woman appeared, her silhouette outlined by the pale glow of the moon. She moved quietly, like the wind itself, pausing only to look toward the horizon. There was a tension in her stance, a silent knowing that danger was near. She didn't look at Luke, but he could see it in her posture. She felt it too. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon like fire, staining the world in crimson and gold. That was when Luke saw them, a dark line of riders cresting the far ridge. Dust rose behind them in a slow, rising cloud. The soldiers had come, just as he feared. The camp began to stir as the warriors sensed what was coming. The quiet morning erupted into chaos. Men shouting, horses whinnying, children crying as mothers gathered them into hiding. The Apache warriors armed themselves with bows, rifles, and courage carved by generations of struggle. They knew this fight wasn't about victory. It was about survival. Luke ran to his horse, his body moving before his mind caught up. He could have ridden away, escaped before the first shot was fired. But his conscience held him fast. He couldn't leave them to die for a mistake that had begun with him. The first volley of gunfire split the morning air. Smoke bloomed in the rising light, curling over the camp as bullets tore through the stillness. Warriors fired back from behind rocks and brush, their rifles cracking like thunder. The battle raged across the plain, fierce and desperate. Luke took cover behind a fallen log, firing his revolver until the barrel burned hot. He moved from spot to spot, covering the retreating families as they fled toward the canyons. The sound of horses and screams filled the air, a symphony of chaos under a blood-red sky. Through the smoke, he saw her, the Apache woman, standing atop a ridge, calling out to her people, her voice strong and steady. She moved with purpose, guiding the children and elders toward safety. A bullet struck the ground near her feet, sending dust into the air, but she didn't flinch. She was unbreakable, a force of nature standing against the storm. Luke's chest tightened. He saw the soldiers closing in on her position, moving through the smoke like ghosts in gray uniforms. Without thinking, he ran. His boots pounded against the earth, his lungs burning, his mind a blur of noise and instinct. He reached her just as the soldiers opened fire again. The impact threw him to the ground, his shoulder bursting with pain. He rolled, grabbing his rifle, and returned fire with wild precision. 2 soldiers fell before the others pulled back to reload. The woman knelt beside him, her hands pressed against his wound, her face tight with determination. Luke's vision blurred, but even through haze of pain, he could see the strength in her eyes. Not fear, not pity, but fierce defiance. The Apache warriors rallied behind her call. They moved like shadows through the dust, striking from every side. For every warrior who fell, 2 soldiers went down. The land itself seemed to fight with them. The rocks, the wind, the dust, all rising in defiance of the invaders. By the time the sun stood high overhead, the battle had turned. The remaining soldiers, bloodied and broken, began to retreat. Some carried the wounded. Others left their dead behind in the red dirt. The fort's pride had been shattered by the fury of the people they had sought to destroy. Luke lay on the ground, his strength fading. Around him, the camp burned, smoke curling into the hot air, the scent of death mingling with the smell of gunpowder. The Apache woman stayed beside him, her shadow falling across his face as she tended to the wound. Her hands were steady, her movements sure. He had expected to die there, to be left behind as the camp moved on. But she refused to leave him. She called to her people, and they lifted him onto a makeshift litter, carrying him toward the mountains, where the survivors were fleeing. The world blurred into motion, cliffs, sky, and fire blending into one. Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind caught between life and death. He remembered flashes, the sound of hooves, the touch of her hand on his chest, the glimmer of tears she didn't let fall. By nightfall, they reached the safety of the high canyons. The wounded were laid among the rocks, and the fires of mourning began to burn. Songs rose into the night, low, haunting, filled with sorrow and defiance. Luke lay among them, half awake, listening to the music of grief. The Apache woman sat beside him, her face illuminated by the flickering light. She looked out over the valley below, where the battlefield still smoked in the distance. In that moment, Luke understood something deeper than words, that she was not just a survivor. She was the spirit of a people who refused to be broken, the fire that even death could not extinguish. As he drifted into sleep, her voice joined the song, soft at first, then strong, carrying through the canyon like a promise. The promise that though the soldiers might return, they would never conquer what lived in her heart. And in the stillness of that night, Luke realized he was no longer her captor, nor her savior, but something else entirely, something bound by fate. The wind rose, carrying embers into the dark, and far below, the horizon flickered with the glow of new fires. The war was not over. It was only changing shape. The days after the battle bled together in silence and smoke. The canyon where the survivors had taken refuge became a sanctuary of the wounded and the mourning. Fires burned low, casting trembling light on faces carved by loss. The wind carried the scent of burned gunpowder and sage, mingling with the faint, sorrowful moaning songs that rose each night. Luke Braddock lay beneath the shelter of a rock ledge, his body broken, his shoulder bound tight with leather and herbs. Every breath was a labor, each heartbeat a reminder of the cost of his choices. He had survived the fight, but survival felt hollow when surrounded by the dead. The Apache woman stayed close, tending to him with quiet purpose. Her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes carried shadows that no words could erase. Each time she dipped the cloth into the water to cool his fever. Her movements were precise, controlled, as though ritual and duty were all that kept her from collapsing under the weight of grief. She had lost family in the raid. Luke could see it in the way she looked toward the horizon at dusk, the place where the sun fell, and the smoke from the fort still stained the sky. There were names she whispered under her breath when she thought no one could hear. Names that belonged to the dead. Days passed. Luke's strength returned slowly, but his mind carried the heaviness of guilt. He had been the spark that brought the soldiers here. His presence had drawn them, like wolves, to the scent of blood. He had tried to make it right, but redemption in the desert came, with a price that could never truly be paid. The Apache camp was different now. The warriors who survived moved like shadows, silent and watchful, preparing for what would come next. They buried their dead in the high rocks, far above the reach of scavengers, marking the graves with painted stones. The women gathered what they could salvage, rebuilding with hands that refused to rest. There was no peace, only the pause between storms. Rumors began to reach them through the wind, whispers carried by traders and scouts hiding in the ravines. The army was regrouping. A new detachment was marching from the south, led by Captain Halloran himself. He wanted revenge. He had lost men, pride, and control, and he would not stop until every Apache who defied him was gone. Luke heard the news from a wounded scout, who stumbled into the canyon one evening, blood crusted on his temple. The man collapsed before the fire and spoke of soldiers marching under the banner of retribution. 50 men, armed and merciless. They were days away. The Apache elders met through the night, their voices low and heavy with decision. Luke watched from a distance, knowing his fate hung in their words. He was both the cause of their suffering and the weapon they might now use to strike back. By dawn, the camp began to move. Warriors gathered rifles, arrows, and powder horns. The women and children prepared to journey deeper into the mountains, away from the path of death that approached. The Apache woman, the one who had once been his captive, stood among them, her expression calm but unreadable. She was no longer the prisoner he had led from the fort. She was a leader now, a symbol of strength and defiance. Her people followed her not because of her bloodline, but because she had faced the soldiers' cruelty and returned alive. Luke rose on unsteady legs, his body still aching but his spirit restless. He couldn't leave them to face Halloran alone. The army wanted him as much as it wanted them, maybe more. He knew the captain. He knew how he thought, how he fought. That knowledge was worth something, and if there was a chance to repay the blood he had cost these people, this was it. He began to prepare his horse, tightening the worn saddle straps with shaking hands. The Apache woman approached, her gaze steady. She said nothing, but her silence carried meaning. There was understanding between them now, a bond forged in battle and blood. When the warriors set out at dusk, Luke rode among them. They moved swiftly, the land swallowing their tracks, as they cut through canyons and arroyos, heading toward the open desert where the soldiers would be forced to march. The plan was simple: draw them in, then strike from the rocks when the sun burned hottest, when their horses grew weak and their throats dry. For 2 days they rode in silence. Luke's body screamed in pain, but his mind stayed sharp. He could see the ghosts of the fallen in every stretch of sand. The men who had died in the fort, the families left in ashes. This was more than revenge. It was balance. When they reached the canyon's mouth, the Apache scouts reported movement. Dust clouds to the east, the shimmer of steel beneath the sun. Halloran's men were coming. Luke stood beside the woman as the warriors took their positions along the high ridges. The heat shimmered around them, distorting the air. The land was quiet again, that same breathless stillness that always came before the storm. He looked out over the horizon, where the soldiers appeared like ants crawling through the sand. Their banners flapped lazily in the heat, their rifles gleaming. At the front rode Captain Halloran, his back straight, his pride unbroken. Luke's jaw tightened. The man was still the same, iron-faced, merciless, and blind to anything beyond his own authority. He didn't see men and women in the hills above him. He saw enemies. The first shot cracked through the silence. Then another. Smoke rose in sharp bursts as the Apache rifles opened fire from above. Horses reared, soldiers shouted, and chaos spread like wildfire. The ambush had begun. Luke rode down from the ridge, firing into the confusion. The world erupted into thunder, rifles, hoofbeats, screams. Dust filled the air until the battle became a blur of movement and sound. The soldiers fought hard, their lines holding for a time, but the land belonged to the Apache. Every rock, every shadow worked against the invaders. As the fighting raged, Luke caught sight of Halloran near the center of the fray, rallying his men. Rage surged through him like fire. Everything, the fort, the captivity, the bloodshed, led to this moment. He spurred his horse forward, cutting through the chaos toward the man who had once held power over both him and the woman whose life he had saved. The two men met in the storm of dust and gunfire, and in that instant, the desert seemed to hold its breath again, as though the land itself waited to see whose blood would fall first. The air in the canyon turned to fire. Smoke coiled through the sunlit haze as the ambush roared to life. The sound of rifles shattered the stillness that had hung heavy over the desert moments before. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the echoes of war rolled against the stone walls like thunder trapped in the earth. Luke Braddock rode into the chaos, his heart hammering with the weight of everything he had lived through. The betrayal, the shame, and the burden of redemption. Each gunshot was another heartbeat, each breath a promise to the ghosts that followed him. Captain Halloran's soldiers tried to form ranks, but the desert was against them. The ground crumbled beneath their boots, and the cliffs above spat fire and death. The Apache warriors struck like shadows, vanishing and reappearing, each shot deliberate and deadly. The wind carried the acrid taste of gunpowder and the cries of dying men. Luke's horse tore through the smoke, muscles trembling beneath his legs. He reloaded by instinct, his body moving with grim purpose. The soldiers he once called brothers were now enemies, not because of their uniforms, but because of what they had done, what they represented. Halloran was at the center of it all, shouting orders, refusing to retreat. His pride burned brighter than his fear. Even as men fell around him, he clung to his authority, his belief that he could tame both land and people by the barrel of a gun. Luke dismounted as the battle pressed toward the canyon mouth. His shoulder burned, his blood dampened his sleeve, but he pushed through it. Every sound blurred together. The clash of metal, the crack of gunfire, the guttural shouts of warriors. Yet through it all, his eyes stayed fixed on Halloran. The captain spotted him at last. Recognition flashed across his face, not with surprise, but with fury, as though seeing Luke alive was an insult to everything he stood for. The two men moved through the chaos like predators drawn by instinct, circling, searching for an opening. Around them, soldiers and warriors fought to the death, but neither man saw anything beyond the other. Luke lunged forward through the dust, his rifle empty, his knife drawn. The two collided with the violence of memory, years of obedience, betrayal, and blood erupting in that single instant. The knife found flesh, then bone, as both men crashed into the dirt. The struggle was silent, brutal, animal. When it ended, Halloran lay still. His blood pooled into the sand, dark and final. The man who had commanded with iron and cruelty was gone, swallowed by the land he had tried to control. Luke staggered to his feet, chest heaving, his hands slick with blood that wasn't all his own. The battle still raged, but its outcome was already written. The soldiers, leaderless and surrounded, began to falter. One by one, they fell or fled, their cries fading into the wind. The Apache had won, but victory in the desert was a hollow thing. It was never without cost. Bodies lay twisted across the rocks, both friend and foe. Smoke drifted upward in thin, trembling lines, carrying the scent of death to the heavens. Luke sank to his knees beside his fallen horse, exhaustion breaking through the numbness. He could feel the warmth of the sand beneath his palms, the throb of pain pulsing through every limb. He had killed to save the very people he once betrayed. But in the end, redemption was not found in blood. It was found in what came after. The Apache woman appeared through the haze, her dark hair tangled by the wind, her face streaked with dust and grief. She moved with quiet grace through the aftermath, tending to the wounded, closing the eyes of the dead. When she reached Luke, she paused. The silence between them said more than words ever could. There was no anger left in her, only understanding. She had seen what he had done, how he had fought beside them. He had repaid the debt that had begun the day they gave her to him as a slave. Luke rose unsteadily, his eyes meeting hers. The desert stretched endlessly around them, harsh, unyielding, but free. In that emptiness, there was a strange peace. Days later, the surviving Apache began their long journey north, deeper into the mountains where the army could not reach. Luke rode with them, though he knew he would not stay. His wounds were healing, but his soul was restless. He belonged to the open land now, to the wind and dust that carried no allegiance, no chains. When they reached the high pass, The woman stopped and turned toward him. Behind her, her people disappeared into the pines, their silhouettes fading like ghosts. Luke watched until she was the last figure left. For a long moment, she stood there, not as a prisoner, not as a symbol, but as a survivor. The mountain light caught her eyes, and in them Luke saw everything had fought for: freedom, dignity, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to be broken. Without a word, she lifted her hand, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. A gesture of balance, of debt repaid. Then she turned and vanished into the wild, leaving Luke alone on the ridge. He remained there for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat, the vast silence of the land surrounding him. The sun fell lower, painting the world in red and gold. He thought of the fort, of the betrayal, of the moment they handed him a woman instead of silver. He thought of how that single act, meant to degrade and divide, had led him here, to a truth greater than any he had known. Freedom could not be bought or given. It was fought for, blood for, and sometimes found in the eyes of someone once called an enemy. As the last light faded over the desert, Luke Braddock mounted his horse and turned toward the horizon. The world ahead was uncertain, but it was his. No masters, no chains. Only the land and the road and the memory of a woman who had taught him the meaning of honor. He rode on until the dust swallowed him, a lone figure against the dying sun, the cowboy who was promised gold, but found redemption instead. And behind him, the desert with its timeless truth: no man owns the land, no man owns another soul.